All right, guys, we're going to talk about my best weeding strategies for the garden that don't involve any chemicals whatsoever. So super nature friendly practices, and they're cheap and easy to do. They do involve some labor though, so do get ready for some work, but it's not overly bad. Let's get into it. I'm absolutely convinced that the main reasons why people give up on gardening really comes down to two things. One, plant murder. Two, that the weeds take over gardens and they become too overwhelming and people just give up. And the two kind of end up combining together because that overwhelmingness eventually kills the plants, and well, you've created more plant murder in the process. And I really want people not to give up on their gardens. It is such a manageable thing with simple strategies that it can help you a great deal. So let's go through those strategies. Let's talk about them a bit, and hopefully they help you with your gardening so you, A, don't commit plant murder, and two, don't give up on gardening. When we first started out, we started out tilling the field and putting in hundreds of green bean plants into the field. At the same time, we were also building our no-till garden, and that took a bit longer, took 3 years to get it right, but we started building that in the same time frame. And by 3 years, and in year 3, we definitely saw that the no-till garden was way better for weed management by far. Like, if anybody asked me what is the best method for keeping weeds down in a garden, I would say no-till, hands down. A raised bed garden also works very well for weed management versus tilling the ground. Tilling the ground is by far the hardest method, the most challenging method to keep weed free. This is an example of an area that we used to till probably about 1.5 years ago. Yeah, probably not last season, but the season before that. We used to till this specific area and plant within it. But it was such a challenge to keep the weeds under control that we shifted our focus to the no-till garden, as the method was just far better. So let's say all you've got is the option is to till a little bit of land space and you don't have the means or the time to create a no-till garden. A lot of these practices can be applied to you. That's a-okay. I just wanted to level set a bit about the fact that if you have the choice, I guarantee you that no-till gardening is by far the easiest way to reduce your weeds. So the first strategy is a simple strategy that probably will leave you going, well, duh. But it really is important to actually make a commitment to it, and that's the rule of thumb to spend 15 minutes a day in the garden. If you spend 15 minutes of the day, not just 15 minutes of the day in the garden, but 15 minutes in the day weeding in the garden, you will find that you stay ahead of the weed pressure so much better if you're giving yourself 15 minutes a day. It's kind of like workouts. You know, they always say, you know, you need to get up and do it and just get started. And if you really can't do 15 minutes, you just do the 15 minutes and then you get off the bike, right? Well, in this case, you're going to do the same thing, but you're going to pick weeds in that process. And what I usually and typically find is that I will weed a lot longer than 15 minutes. There are some days where I'm like, no, I'm not into this, and I'm done. But for the most part, I spend quite a bit of time picking weeds, and it's good exercise, good for the soul, all that stuff. Strategy is buckets. Buckets everywhere, buckets. What I did is somebody put on Facebook, hey, I've got a whole bunch of these tree buckets. They planted a bunch of trees and they had all these black buckets, and they're like, does anybody want them? It was like 30 of them. I took all 30 of them and then I just placed them anywhere throughout the garden. And it makes a huge difference in just being so easy to stop, pick a weed, put it in the bucket, and not carry it around with you. The new chore becomes emptying the bucket now, but literally having them almost everywhere makes a huge difference, because you know that you can just stop quickly if you're doing something else in the garden, put the weed that you can see right there in the bucket, and keep moving on whatever it was you were doing before. Picking weeds, I'm focused on the ones that are really, really nasty. First and foremost, I certainly will pick them all eventually, but this guy here, this one's chamber bitters. Never seen this in Canada. It will develop all these little balls underneath. That's the seeds, and then it'll drop them, and there'll be hundreds of them. So I will definitely, when I'm out and about, I always target the weeds that I know are super annoying. So in Mississippi, two of the most annoying weeds that I experience is chamber bitters, that one I just showed you, as well as pig's weed. It's in the amaranth family. Oh, they explode and then they become really hard to get out of the garden. So I really focus on them. Back in Canada, dandelion dandelion was actually one of the most aggressive weeds. I never minded them in my grass. They were great for the bumblebees. Lots of people didn't like them in their grass, and that's why they used chemicals to get rid of them. But I always had the weedy grass. But of course I would pick them out of the garden, and they were aggressive at getting into the garden because they easily float into the air. So, and then grasses were very common back in Canada. Not super bad. I honestly think Mississippi wins when it comes to weeds. It is a jungle here, and weeds come in. Like, I'm impressed with tomato plants becoming weeds, dill plants becoming weeds. I mean, I love that. I have a million loofahs this year. They are a weed. But in general, the environment makes it so incredibly easy for things to become weeds here, and that's a good thing and a bad thing, especially a bad thing when you get things like chamber bitters. Kudzu, I believe that one came over, but that one we actually brought over into the US. Well, not me personally, I was Canadian at the time, but but at some point somebody had the idea that kudzu was a good idea, brought it over, and now it's an absolute disaster. So the next method is about just adding soil to the top as opposed to digging it up and tilling it every time. When you add soil to the top, you do your own kind of smothering, and you don't till up any new seeds. So it becomes much easier to keep the soil clean. You only have to get what lands in new on top. And I just add about 2 inches to the top, maybe a bit more, and I have great luck with very few weeds. Now you can see that weeds eventually come in. There's a very small number of them coming along the sides, and that's what has flown in or come in through other ways, and I haven't gotten in one of my 15-minute tours. The next one is actually creating weed barriers around your garden. This is honestly amazing at helping to reduce weeds in your garden. Even though I have a bagged lawnmower that I only use around the garden, it still shoots grass seed into the garden area. Grass will grow and stretch, and I'll show you examples of that, and it'll grow into your garden where it can. So keeping a weed barrier, and I've done it in a couple of different ways, I'll show you each different way, but keeping a weed barrier really reduces the chances of the weeds actually reaching your garden. So you kind of got clear separation from your grass space to your garden space, and kind of a safe space in between. So you can see I've used a black plastic as a weed barrier here. This is just a cheap plastic. It's the same plastic I'll talk about in a bit for using as a weed kill. This is maybe 15 bucks. You can find it on Amazon, or you can find it on Walmart. I'll have some links in the description down below. Also used recycled materials as a weed barrier as well. So these little platforms that you see along here, these were being thrown away by one of my husband's employers. These are heavy, quite heavy metal, and they are excellent weed barriers along the way. Now, over time, they still get weeds in between. Any method that you use, it doesn't matter. Weeds, if you've ever seen that meme where the dandelion is growing in the rocks and can survive anything kind of thing, it's true. Weeds will show up and pop up anywhere. And some of these weeds I let happen for a reason. So this is Gaillardia. This is a native plant that I obviously let happen for a reason. Landscaping fabric will actually be one that I don't really overly recommend. You spend a lot of money to buy it, probably looking at a good $200 for a large, piece of it. You can get smaller pieces of it from anywhere from $30 to $100, but for a piece probably as big as this, you're probably looking at about $200. And this is a commercial grade landscaping cloth. It still grows weeds on the top. They still pop through the material, and I don't find it overly worth it. So I'd much rather create a space that I use mulches and or black plastic. This is a really good example of why you should have space between your yard and your garden area. This is all grass that's just stretching in and growing in, pop-ups of weeds that are flying in, and it's becoming overwhelming. So I'm going to have to get in here and clean it out and maintenance it a lot more than if I had some sort of spacing between it that didn't allow the grass so easily to get in here. You can see also here how the raised bed works way better, because look at the grass can't reach the top of the box. So I can easily take this out and it won't make its way into the raised bed. So raised beds definitely deserve some credit here. They're a great way to go for gardening to make sure that you have fewer weeds. And here's how the grass would operate. You can see the seeds are on here at the end, and they're just trying to reach the garden, which is just over there. One seems to have made it. I need to get that guy. But essentially this allows me to just easily get it as it stretches its way out into the garden before it makes its way into the garden and overwhelms me. But it literally will become a carpet of weeds over top of these separations. Okay, let's get right into the garden. This is the area where you really, really don't want a mass amount of weeds. In my no-till garden, you're going to see a couple of different things. You see the dirt lines here. These are the mounds. Essentially, they get added new soil almost every year, maybe every 2 years. And then in the center there is mulch. And then in this particular row, it's black plastic. I do black plastic on some of them because the water pressure seems to flow in certain rows. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to keep putting in mulch that gets pushed out. So I leave the areas that have quite a bit of water flow. They basically become little rivers in the heavy rain. But we keep them with black plastic so it allows the water to flow, but it keeps the weeds suppressed as well. So after a couple of years of using mulch, mulch is by far my favorite way to prevent weeds in a garden. Highly, highly recommend using mulch in your garden. Doesn't mean that you won't still get weeds. You will still absolutely have weeds pop up. They fly in, that kind of stuff. It's going to happen, but they're going to be exceptionally easy to pull. Have a couple of little weeds growing in the mulch and you'll just see how easy it is to just pull them right out, because they end up with very loose soil over time as opposed to soils that are really, really, really constricting of the roots. Here you'll get a little weed in here. It's super easy to pull, and that's just because your soil is really loose in a no-till garden and in the mulch. So I find weeding in this type of garden and in the mulch so much easier because it doesn't cling on to the roots super bad. There are lots of different things that you can use as mulch. I've used straw. We got a whole bunch of recycled straw given to us one year. We used that. That was not my wisest move because the straw just produced more straw. So don't use straw. I really don't recommend that. You can also use, and this is very common in the south, I don't know if we'd use it as much in Canada, but you can use pine needles. Now pine needles are flammable and they don't always stay in place super easy. It's not super bad, but they might not stay as well. But the flammable part, you really don't want that near your house, but they can be free, cheap, easy to get because there's a lot of pine trees, especially in South Mississippi. Now, the one that I like the most is bark mulch. It's really not overly expensive if you have the ability to get a truckload direct from a supplier. We go to Philip Barks locally and they are absolutely awesome. It costs us $40, maybe $50 for a truckload of bark mulch, and I just refresh it. The first year was the most expensive. I think it took 2 truckloads to do the garden, and then after that we just get about a truckload every year and just freshen up areas that seem to be wearing thin. With bark mulch though, you do want to be careful that is not near your house as well, because they can attract termites, so you don't want that one near your house. What happens when an area gets a little bit out of control? Maybe not super out of control, it's still manageable, but maybe not for hand picking. This is where I use 2 of my favorite tools. First one is a Sturup hoe. This guy is awesome. I actually have one with a pointed stirrup and I hate it. This is the best one with the flat stirrup, and it's just the right way that it sits and hits the soil. And then also a hand one as well. And I'm going to show you how I use them. So I've got this little area here. It doesn't have, the mulch is worn off. It's actually because it gets quite a bit of water in here. So we're going to try and get rid of these guys rather than doing it by hand, very quickly by scraping this over the top of the soil. This works incredibly well on dry days because when you do this, the plants sit on the top of the soil and just burn and die. If you do this on a really wet day, these actually can reroot, so you'll want to collect them and make sure that you put them in one of your buckets. The stirrup works in the same manner, just easier from above. And this would be easier with not holding a phone. Like your buckets, I also recommend having your tools really handy, like I have them all throughout the garden. Maybe I'll hang them on a pole. Some sitting in an old mailbox in another area. You're just trying to stay ahead of weed seed production because you want to keep it manageable. You don't want it to get away on you, you don't want it to kill off your plants, and you don't want it to overwhelm you, so you keep gardening every year. Okay, so the next one is occultation, and I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it's essentially solarizing the ground, only solarizing is technically done, I've learned now, thanks to you guys, that it is clear plastic that does solarization. Black plastic is occultation. I don't know. Joanese, I always speak Joanese. So essentially using black plastic to kill weeds is a phenomenal method for an area that gets too much or overwhelming, and I'm going to show you how I've used it here. In the same garden space that we looked at earlier that doesn't have a border, we have a small, this used to be an herb garden, it still kind of is, but it's been taken over by other plants and a little bit of mint that has made it. I'm rethinking this area, I want it done differently, and if I had one recommendation, you can see that these boxes are not very tall. There is a border around it, but on these sides the border is against the grass, and that makes it very overwhelming, and that's exactly what happened here. I used to have an entire strawberry patch in here, and it had become so overwhelmed with grasses and other weeds that I had to pick out a few strawberries and replant them in another container, and then I had to deal with this space. So I used the black plastic to kill all the weeds. Now all I will have to do is clean this out. I might have to use the black plastic a second time to just do a second weed kill once the rain hits the soil in here, but by the second time that usually does it, and it's pretty clean soil through there. But I'm really going to have to rethink this area because anything that's right up against grass, you're always going to be fighting that. The taller you can make your space against your grass, or the longer you can make it away from the grass, the better off you will be in reducing that pressure. Black plastic works really well for killing off weeds. I have never had success with clear plastic. It lets in too much light. It's said to be hotter than black plastic underneath, but I've never seen it. The plants were still living every time I tried to do it. Black plastic always seemed to work best, so it's the method I recommend most. And I will use that when I clear out of a bed sometimes, and I'll just do it just to make sure I've got all the weeds killed off. I would definitely use black plastic throughout the garden when I need to take over a space and regain it from something. Plastic doesn't kill the microbes in the soil. There's quite a bit of research out there that even clear plastic might kill the microbes in the soil. They can't say for how long. They say that might only be a short-term impact. But studies do show that black plastic does not kill the microbes, but it does kill the pathogens, which is really good when you're dealing with things like birds drop in pathogens, or you might bring it in through compost or dogs in the bathroom, that kind of thing. So pathogens are great to kill off, so black plastic will actually do that for you. So here's an example of how I've used black plastic in just a small section. This little section isn't working well for me. The weeds really started to take off because of the landscaping fabric that I'm not a big fan of. So I use a little piece of black plastic to kill off the weeds that are growing underneath here. So I think you're getting the theme here. Keep it easy, keep it simple, make it something that you can do when you're just wandering through the garden. I literally will get up in the morning, grab myself my coffee, lose my coffee because I followed a trail of weeds and put my coffee down somewhere, and it just becomes part of my routine. So it's honestly a very easy practice. So have buckets handy, have your tools handy, 15 minutes a day, use solarization, use mulch, create space for the garden. The higher, the better, the longer, the better. So those types of things will really make a difference in your weed management in your garden. And if you can, go with a no-till garden. You'll find it's much easier for weed management in general. If you can't do no-till, then try the other strategies. They should help you at least a bit. And essentially all you're trying to do is stay ahead of weed seed production. You just want to stay ahead of that. If you can do that, your season will not get overwhelmed, and you'll probably even win a bit year over year. Because I find I think this is year 4 or 5 with this no-till garden, I find very lot less weeds in the garden year over year, as long as I stay on top of them. We did have a season where we were gone for a good portion of the summer and it came back to a lot, but for the most part, if you stay on top of them, you will reduce the numbers overall. I'll put links in the description down below for any of the tools that we've used in this video, as well as any previous videos that talk more in depth about no-till and or solarization. If you have any other ideas for weeding strategies, make sure you put them in the comments below to share with everybody else. We'd love to hear about them. Let's just skip out on the chemicals though. I know that they're quick and they are definitely easy, but right here we're all about protecting nature and ensuring that nature does not get something that they don't need in their diet. So let's pass on the chemicals. All right guys, be friendly, be kind.